All right, so welcome to Virtue Ethics. So Virtue Ethics is a new section of the course. The new section of the course is devoted to the idea that the moral life is a balance. And immediately you can see this is different than certainly the extremes of radical egotism and complete altruism. So what is a moral person in a virtue ethicist perspective? It is someone who is able to develop virtues. And ultimately, these virtues are going to be tied to moderation. But before we get to the actual virtues themselves, one of the big important points about this moral theory is that it is focused not so much on systems of rules that is going to tell you kind of exactly what to do in a particular situation, but it's based on the idea of becoming a particular type of person. So again, it's not this systematic kind of law book, kind of handbook, rule book, however you want to say it. It's more the idea that you become a person that is virtuous, that has certain behavioral and personality characteristics that are deemed to be good, and then you will act on them in your actual life. So the idea is be virtuous, and then you will do good things. So again, the focus is on character, the focus is on the person, the focus is on behavior and personality characteristics, not on a system of rules. Okay, so that's maybe the first major point of virtue ethics. And with this idea that there is no rule book, education becomes really critical to the virtue ethicist perspective. And it's not education, at least solely education, in terms of a classroom model where you sit down and you kind of study morality. It's much more a model that is based on lived experience. And what virtue ethicists will say is critical to education are habits. The habits that we develop can be very, very difficult to break, particularly the habits that we develop when we're young. Whether they're good or bad habits, once they're developed, once they're instilled in us, they become very, very challenging to overcome. And if you develop good habits, that's great. If you develop virtuous habits and you're a virtuous person, then that habit of acting on virtue at some point will become kind of internalized and it'll seem to kind of flow naturally from you. But the same thing can occur with vice, with immorality. If you're a bad person, you develop bad characteristics and bad habits, those will also at a certain point tend to flow seemingly naturally from you. And just kind of as an example of how to think about habits, you could fold your arms. And everybody folds their arms a particular way. But if I ask you to fold your arms the opposite way, most people will feel that to be very awkward. It won't feel right. It'll feel like something's wrong. And that's because we're in the habit of folding arms a certain way. We're in the habit maybe of saying please or thank you. We're in the habit of saying sir to those that are older than us, perhaps. So whatever habits you develop, you tend to then at some point do them instinctually, almost naturally. And so virtue ethicists think that you must get good habits, virtuous habits when you're young. And part of that education is training you in certain situations. So if courage is a virtue to be developed, a virtue ethicist will say, well, we have to put you in situations where you have to exhibit the characteristic of courage or patience or good humor or level-headedness, whatever the virtue is that you are trying to develop. You have to put someone in that situation and then see how they do and work on them to act correctly, work on them to exhibit that virtue. The other kind of big thing with a virtue ethicists are role models. So role models are extremely important. And again, because we don't have a rule book, we don't have this kind of systematic principles that are going to tell us exactly what to do in a particular situation, real life is messy. Real life is tricky. It's not always clear what to do. And a virtue ethicist will admit that in some situations, two good, virtuous people could do opposite things because they're acting maybe on different virtues or they're applying them in slightly different ways. And they accept the fact that there's ambiguity in the moral life. So they say, well, how do we, what's another asset? What's another way that we can learn about virtue? Unless they look to people that are good. Look at how they live their lives. Look at what they do in tough situations. You may not get one series of principles that all virtuous people do, but you will gain insight into how you can navigate the gray areas of the world. Okay, so that's all part of education, and you need a society. Virtue ethicists will say society is critically important. Who is educating you? How you're being educated? How that is reinforced in society? All of that is critical to developing into a good person. So virtue ethicists, when they think about what it means to be virtuous, they have a holistic ethics. And a holistic ethics means that reason is important, it's critical. We're meant to be creatures that are guided by reason. But it's not simply that we think the right way or we do the right thing. Virtue ethicists are always concerned about emotions as well. Emotions and how you feel are critical to a virtue ethicist. And a virtue ethicist will say that you can actually be a bad person not simply because of what you do or how you think, but of how you feel. And the example that I think really illustrates this well that I always use in class is the idea of road rage. Most of us have experienced road rage, where we have this kind of deep sense of raw rage at somebody that's on the road with us. And some of us will honk our horns or make obscene gestures or curse at the other driver or follow them closely. Whatever it is that you do, it's a product of this rage. And what you do may be bad. It may be considered immoral. But even if you didn't do anything, the virtue ethicists will say the rage that you feel is immoral. That is a problem. You shouldn't feel that way. And some people say, well, I can't help how I feel. Feelings aren't under my control. But a virtue ethicist will say, no. Part of your habit training, part of education, is to train your feelings in a certain way, to train them to be moderate, to train them to not get out of control. And if you haven't done that, you can't be considered a truly rational or a truly good person. So how you feel is critical to whether or not you're a good person. Another key element of virtue ethics is the idea of sociability, being social. For a virtue ethics ethicist, you can only develop virtue within a society, and if you're in a society that is not virtuous, then you could very likely live an immoral and ultimately miserable life. So you're meant to be social creatures. We are meant to be political creatures. So if you are not paying attention to the world around you, you don't have to know all the details of every event that occurs. It would be impossible. But certainly if you're not paying attention to some of the big stories of the day, if you have no idea how your government works, if you have no idea how your education system works, if you have no idea what it means to be a good citizen in your society, then you're wrong. You're immoral. You're kind of abstracting yourself. You're pulling yourself out of society. You're not participating. And that refusal to participate for a virtue ethicist is fundamentally wrong. And if you don't do it, then you should be ashamed of yourself. And I have a little quiz that we do in class that's also up on NU Learn that you can take if you're curious as to how well you pay attention to the world around you. Okay. So now we've talked about, who is the good person? The good person is someone who is virtuous, who develops virtuous characteristics. The good person is one who has developed their feelings in virtuous ways. And the good person is one who is social. But what is it that actually defines the virtues? How do we figure out, what is a good characteristic to have and what is a bad characteristic to have? And virtue ethicists refer to the principle of the golden mean. And essentially what this is that a principle of moderation. It's a principle of kind of the middle way. And so what is good? Behaviors, emotions, characteristics that are good are going to be the middle point between two behavioral and emotional extremes. So if you're at the extremes, you're bad, you're wrong for a virtue ethicist. And if you're in the middle, you're good. So what are some examples? Well, courage is the middle point between two extremes. The extreme of excess, which would be kind of a rashness, a recklessness, Kind of you fly off at the handle the moment someone insults your girlfriend, or, you're going to kind of run into danger without any precaution, without any thoughts. That would be reckless. That would be rash. And that's wrong. It's courageous, but it's an excess of courage, and therefore it is immoral. The other extreme, which would be the lack, is cowardice, where you never stand up, where you never fight for your principles, where you never assert yourself. And for a virtue ethicist, the person who is a coward is wrong. They shouldn't be doing what they're doing. Okay, another example. Being respectful is a virtue. It's a middle point between kind of a brown-nosing, where you're being a supplicant, where you're kind of just, trying to worship another person, essentially. That's an excess of respect. The lack of respect is disrespect. So you certainly shouldn't be that. Another kind of, let's talk about a behavior. Healthy living would be a good thing, would be a middle point. The excess of healthy living would be kind of an obsessive exerciser, where you exercise 7-8 hours a day, and it's not your job. It's not you're not a professional athlete. Your whole life is devoted to that being as perfectly physically healthy as possible. That's an excess. And of course, the opposite would be to not be physically active or live well, to be lazy, to be gluttonous. If you don't exercise for a virtue ethicist, you're immoral because you're at that other extreme, that lack. So this is fun. I mean, the virtue ethics are always very interesting to think about. Okay, well, what is a virtue? What is the excess of that virtue? What is the lack of that virtue? And think about your own life and what that means. So once you develop these virtues, it's kind of like you have a toolbox. You can pull up your courage when you need it. You can pull up your patience when you need it. You can pull up your ability to speak kindly, your compassion when you need it. Toughness when you need it. So all the whole virtues that you have in a toolbox. And then the idea is to apply them to the right person at the right time, in the right way, to the right degree. And that's where there's a lot of gray. It's not always clear how you apply them, and good people can disagree. But good people will be acting and behaving toward others in a virtuous way, and that's because they've developed these tools. So the final thing I'll leave you with, and it started this video as well, is that virtue ethics is a middle point, and that means that they are going to avoid extremes. So if we think about that in terms of the course theme, radical egotism would be out. It would be an excess of self-absorption. It would be an excess of attention to oneself. But so too would be complete altruism. There would be lack of attention to oneself, or a complete and utter devotion to others. And that might sound pretty good, but it does raise a really fascinating point. Does virtue ethics annul, get rid of, make impossible the idea of a saint? I mean, somebody like St. Francis, somebody like Jesus, who seem like they devote themselves completely to others, would appear to be immoral according to the logic of a virtue ethicist, because they're at the extreme. So whether that makes the theory good or bad or insufficient or possesses a need for further development, I will leave you to decide.